Justin.
Thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the Heartland Institute. I'm going to start with 3 dates: January 20th, April 14th, and May 26th. Remember those 3 as we talk today. I'm going to suggest to you that they're the most significant days in 2021 so far that may alter the future of oil and natural gas exploration, production, and use in the United States. Does anyone know what happened on those 3 days? First one's pretty obvious, right? President Biden's first day in office. With the stroke of a pen, his executive order canceled the Keystone XL pipeline permit. His quote was interesting, though. He said, "The permit is hereby revoked. Leaving the Keystone XL pipeline permit in place would not have been consistent with my administration's economic and climate imperatives." Notice that he put economic before climate when he canceled Keystone. That stroke of a pen destroyed at least 1,000 jobs, and it set the trajectory for the Biden administration. The second date, April 14th. Does anyone know what happened on that day? It's less obvious. But by a vote of 53 to 45 in the U.S. Senate, Gary Gensler was confirmed to the top spot at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Part of the ever-revolving door between D.C. and Wall Street, Gensler has given every indication that under his direction, the SEC is going to set up an ESG, environment, social, and governance regulatory regime that would dramatically increase the cost of business for many industries, but especially fossil fuel interests. It's anyone's guess just how many jobs Gensler and his team are going to destroy. The third date, May 26th. Anybody know what happened on that day that's important? ExxonMobil had its annual shareholder meeting. The annual gathering of investors doesn't always make headline news, but it sure did this year. That's because not 1, not 2, but 3 dissident climate change activists were elected to the board of directors. Their stated goal is to get Exxon out of the oil and gas business altogether. They're now on the board. How many jobs is that going to destroy, and for what? Which leads me to my primary question. Are you all awake to the woke? You better be. Right now, the energy industry faces the combination of the most woke presidential administration in American history, emboldened and organized activist investors, and woke capital on Wall Street that gets to dictate who is and isn't permitted to get capital. That's a 3-headed hydra that won't be easy to slay, but we'd all better try. If you're going to get canceled, it's better to get canceled going down fighting, right? Well, who am I and why the heck am I talking to you? My name's Justin Danhof, as Craig said. I'm the Executive Vice President at the National Center for Public Policy Research, where we house the Free Enterprise Project. Again, FEEP, we've been shareholder activists for more than a decade for the right. We file resolutions, engage CEOs and board members at annual meetings, issue comments on federal rules related to ESG. Our whole goal is to create the effective campaigns for companies to focus on their primary incentives, that is, their shareholders. But this isn't about me or FEEP. We've lived so long in the belly of this corporate beast that we have a tremendous insight into exactly the activist left and how they operate to effectuate change in the corporate cultural lane. Because guess what, folks? They did it all in plain sight. None of this was done in a smoke-filled room or behind mirrors. So, you may be asking yourself, why would a conservative group engage in activism, in corporate activism? Isn't that what left-wing agitators are for? It's precisely because so many of you ask that question and have that inclination that we do it. The left has been so vocal and strategic at engaging business that many leading companies now march in lockstep with the political left. And we know what the far left thinks of the oil and natural gas industries. Were any of you surprised when those Exxon activists were appointed to the board? We weren't. We were warning about it. People should have heeded our warnings. Some call the phenomenon we are witnessing woke capitalism. I don't prefer to call it that. Some refer to this as just part of corporate social responsibility, but now it's really just under the ESG banner. But no matter what you call it, this marks a paradigm shift where corporations are now beholden to a set of, quote, stakeholders rather than their shareholders. You know, those measly folks that actually invest their hard-earned capital and to the enterprise. And when you talk to your family and friends and ESG comes up, people's eyes tend to gloss over. Just change the definition. ESG is whatever a liberal political interest group is trying to achieve through business, and largely successfully achieving through business. So don't let their eyes gloss over, reorient them. And when it comes to stakeholder capital, did you guys realize that in 2019, in August of that year, the Business Roundtable formally repudiated its shareholder model of capitalism in favor of stakeholder capitalism? Successful companies have always looked out for their workers, their customers, their communities. So the 2019 statement was really nothing new. What was new was the roundtable, the business community, was parroting the language of Elizabeth Warren and AOC. I'm here to talk about how the business community, along with the Biden administration, got so woke, but more importantly, how we can combat it. Because I'm here to tell you that the woke has its sight firmly set on every aspect of the traditional energy production, distribution, and use. One of the tools that the left has used to influence corporate behavior is shareholder activism. Over the last 15 plus years, a vast network of liberal organizations has used shareholder activism to bully, co-opt, and influence corporate America. And as you heard, it represents trillions of dollars in assets. And this network designates significant resources to gain influence in the following areas: the environment, healthcare, social and religious issues, life and the abortion debate, free speech, freedom of association, increasingly racial justice, philanthropic giving, and of course, they target any company that would ever give to a right-of-center politician or trade association. Now, I'm not here to rail against business itself. Remember, American free market capitalism is the greatest economic system man has ever implemented. But wokeness is a cancer. So we ought to try and kill the cancer while we save the host. But just to set the stage, let's see where American business is right now. I'm going to briefly touch on two issues that are fundamental to the fabric of American culture: voter integrity and the Equality Act. This spring, after Georgia passed constitutional and common sense voter integrity reforms, Major League Baseball pulled its All-Star game out of Atlanta, costing the city over $100 million. Many leading companies came out against the measures, claiming that they were wildly racist. And when it comes to the Equality Act, you may not be following it, but it's important. This legislation passed in the House and is currently with the Senate. It would do tremendous harm to women in numerous settings, including sports, women-owned businesses, and shelters. Oh, and it quite literally excises the Religious Freedom Restoration Act out of federal law. That puts Americans of faith at great risk. But you know who backs it? You know who's supporting it? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, and more than 400 companies have signed up with the Human Rights Campaign to lobby in support of it at the U.S. Senate. Think about that. Even Barack Obama didn't support the evisceration of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So we're at a point in American history where the Chamber, NAM, and Roundtable are to the political left of Barack Obama. How do we get there? On basically every affinity issue you can think of, there are coordinated efforts to dictate corporate capital and action. So to figure out what we must do to combat ESG, stakeholder capitalism, wokeness, whatever you want to call it, we need to answer some basic questions. How does the left influence corporate action and why? Let me start with the why. In my estimation, the left uses corporate activism so well because it realizes three key things. First, corporations are much more amenable to pressure than most of our politicians in DC, right? Most of them live in a gerrymandered district. It's hard to get them to move off an issue. Second, corporations can move much more quickly than the political, legislative, or legal process to effect change. Third, corporations can have an immediate economic jobs impact on a targeted region. Again, think about what Major League Baseball did to Atlanta. Cost them over $100 million. As Andrew Breitbart was fond to say, politics is downstream from culture. I'll add that it's upstream from business. So the second question then, how? How does the left do it? In a word, and if you take away one word from today, it's engagement. One way the left engages is through the shareholder vote. Thousands of votes are cast each year that you may not be aware of, but you should be, because they have a dramatic effect on our collective culture. They take place at annual corporate shareholder meetings. There's 3 sets of votes, one for the board members, one for management proposals, and the third is shareholder proposals. And what happens at these meetings is frankly shameful, and it's shameful to all of us in this room. It's the equivalent of a red or purple state election that goes blue every single year because the left shows up to weaponize and use their money, and we can't even be bothered to vote. At the Free Enterprise Project, we file between 20 to 25 liberty-based proposals per year. Steve Malloy, who's here, who many of you know, he files a handful more. Liberal groups file between 400 and 500 of these annually. This network isn't made up of fringe left-wing investors. Rather, it includes some of the nation's largest pension funds, asset managers, environmental groups, trade unions, liberal religious orders, progressive foundations, and wealthy individuals. In any given year, 80 to 120 left-wing groups are active in these campaigns, and Scott's going to tell you more about them in a little bit. And while they aren't all fringe groups, they certainly have fringe ideas. Many of these groups believe in Marxist causes. They have absolutely zero interest in the financial performance of the companies that they engage in. Remember that, they don't care about the bottom line. Pardon the pun, but they use the proxy as a proxy in the culture wars. The left knows that they don't have to win a legal or legislative battle all the time to change the culture. If they can change business behavior and actions, sometimes that's going to be enough. Some examples in recent years. President Trump rightly pulls the United States out of the Paris Climate Accords, right? That's okay. We'll just pass a resolution demanding the companies unilaterally join it. Liberals in Congress can't pass a law mandating racial and gender quotas for corporate boards. It's wildly unconstitutional. They know that. That's okay. We'll just make companies do it unilaterally through a shareholder vote. The left gets mad at states that dare to do things like pass pro-life legislation or pass laws dictating that, I don't know, boys play against boys and girls play against girls in sports. That's not a problem. The activists will just demand that companies stop doing business in these states, and they're winning. I think you get the point, but I still get pushback. Folks will say to me, Justin, shareholder proposals aren't legally binding on corporations. Why should we care? It's simple, they move the needle. What the left-wing activists are asking for today will become mainstream in 3 or 4 years if we don't do something to stop it at the infancy. Let me give you one good illustration. 3 to 4 years ago, liberal shareholders, with the support of Jesse Jackson, started filing shareholder resolutions demanding affirmative action for boards of directors. Well, fast forward to 2020, that's when Goldman Sachs announced its new policy that it would no longer finance a company's IPO, its initial public offering, unless its board was sufficiently diverse in its eyes. And that's when NASDAQ also put a plan in place to kick any company off its own exchange unless it has at least 2 diverse board seats. Think about that. They're going to kick companies off of a public exchange if they don't diversify their board. Guess who's exempt from that? Chinese companies, by the way. They don't have to comply. And I want to spend another word on NASDAQ. We're the plaintiffs, Scott and I are, in a lawsuit against the SEC for approving NASDAQ's racist and sexist scheme. And you had better hope we win. If the NASDAQ is allowed to delist its own members for not diversifying its boards, you can bet that they're going to come back in a year or two and say, well, we're also going to kick companies off that aren't carbon neutral by 2035. And remember what I said, that this is a pattern? In the area of boardrooms, do you know what the activists are demanding these days? Non-management set-aside quotas on boards. What does that mean? What's that code for? Union members. I don't know about you, but I don't want the SEIU setting corporate policy in America. That scares the heck out of me. And public interest law firms in this room and elsewhere on the right really need to start thinking about expanding into this area. We're really good at lawsuits on property rights, right? Well, what are shareholder rights? They're property rights. It's been very frustrating to try and find firms that'll take on these cases. So let's look at what happened in the 2021 shareholder season. We filed 24 liberty-oriented shareholder resolutions. Steve Malloy filed another handful. Meanwhile, the left filed more than 400. And to put this in financial terms, just one organization in this network, CalPERS, manages $400 billion in assets. By comparison, the entire conservative shareholder activist effort has a budget of less than $1 million. I wouldn't even put up a pie chart for you because you wouldn't see the sliver. That's how much money they're putting behind it and how few dollars we are. And with this outsized influence, what was the number one topic of the left shareholder proposals this year? The environment. These include resolutions relating to carbon asset risks, climate change lobbying disclosures, GHG emission reduction targets, net zero, proposals targeting natural gas development specifically, high carbon financing, and much, much more. And liberal shareholder proposals are experiencing record levels of success. Just ask the fine folks at Chevron. Last year, over objection of the company's board, 53%, and I'm using air quotes, of Chevron shareholders approved a resolution calling for increased climate change lobbying disclosures and called on the company to align its policies with the Paris Climate Accord. Politico dubbed this a watershed moment for climate activists. I call it a disaster. And strikingly, the proposal really had nothing to do with climate. What were they really doing? They were going after the climate-related lobbying. They were trying to silence anyone that's not on board with the current climate change hysteria. The proposal should have more honestly been titled, "Name names and then we will sully your company and your trade associations until you stop funding climate skeptics." If you don't believe me, just ask the fine folks at ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Using lies about ALEC's voter integrity work and completely made up stories about work it doesn't even do in the climate change arena, liberal shareholder activists have scared more than 100 companies over the years to end their affiliation with ALEC, to end their corporate sponsorship. Many companies that left ALEC did so under these shareholder pressure campaigns. And another thing about these activists that the companies should keep in mind, let alone everyone in this room, is they're never satisfied. You can't satiate a mob. So all of those companies that left ALEC, guess what? Now they have resolutions saying leave the chamber, leave NAM, leave all of your other trade associations. Many of these trade associations aren't even right of center anymore. They're far left, frankly. But that doesn't matter. Once the left labels you an enemy, you're an enemy for life. Does anyone think, oh, let's turn back to Chevron this year. Were they satisfied with their victory in 2020, the activists? Of course not. So this year they filed a resolution calling on Chevron to cut its Scope 3 emissions, basically end your existence as a company. How did that one fare? 61% of shareholders voted in favor of that one. And next year they're going to be back for another pound of flesh. Take that to the bank. Does anyone honestly think that far-left climate activists are better suited to make decisions about Chevron's lobbying priorities and emission goals than the company's management is? No, that's nonsense. More importantly, do most shareholders that invest their money with Chevron with the hopes of actually making a return on their investment want the company to put itself on the track to go out of business? Of course not, but that's not what's being reflected in the vote. So it's worth examining these results to see how the proxy vote got so disassociated from the financial goals of actual investors. Well, I'll tell you, the vote's rigged. Most stock in America is held institutionally. If you own a mutual fund, for example, you've almost certainly given up your rights to vote your corporate proxy ballots, let alone the problems with ETFs. And when it comes to advising fund managers how to vote their proxies, two firms control more than 90% of the market. One is called ISS, Institutional Shareholder Service, and the other is called Glass Lewis. And they are extremely woke. Well, how do I know? Well, it's in black and white. In the 12 years I've been filing resolutions, they've never once recommended a vote for a right of center resolution of mine, yet they regularly support far-left resolutions, including both of those at Chevron and all three activist board members at Exxon. Although they're supposed to be neutral arbiters, they're anything but. Think about it. Tell me how aligning their policies with the Paris Climate Accord would increase the bottom line of Chevron. It wouldn't. The results of ISS and Glass Lewis' shift have been dynamic. For the longest time, ESG shareholder proposals universally received single-digit support. However, in 2018, they broke every record, getting 24.8% of the vote. In 2019, they broke the record again, moving up to 25.2% on average. While that number declined slightly to 24.4% in 2020, last year saw a record number of climate change proposals break the 50% barrier, and that trend is continuing this year. What's causing more liberal environmental resolutions to break the 50% mark? In one word, BlackRock. In two words, Larry Fink. Now, Steve's going to tell you more about Fink, but let me just give you a little bit of flavor on his role in corrupting this process. BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world. BlackRock has about $10 trillion in assets under management. And since Wall Street is such a follow-the-leader game, other asset managers such as State Street and Vanguard often take direction from BlackRock. Now, the key thing to note about these three firms is that they are asset managers, meaning that the $10 trillion that BlackRock has, that's not Larry Fink's, that's other people's money. So for the longest time, it was industry standard that these passive investment houses didn't vote on their proxies. Think about it. How could you possibly vote the will of millions of individual investors who have disparate opinions on board members and climate policy and gender quotas for boards? You couldn't. That would be presumptuous. But presumptuous is exactly what Larry Fink is. So in 2018, he decided, heck, I'm just going to change the model and start voting. That year, he wrote his annual letter to CEOs, and he explained that the company was going to get much more aggressive in voting our corporate ballots. He wrote at length about the need for action on climate change and the business's role in fixing a myriad of social issues in society. While liberal activists cheered this initial move, year after year they continued to complain about BlackRock, saying that they're not doing enough to pressure business on ESG. Remember what I said earlier, you can never appease the liberal mob. So in 2020, BlackRock upped the ante and voted against more than 5,400 board members, largely, they said, because they weren't taking enough action on climate change. But even that wasn't enough. So at the end of last year, a group of Democrat senators sent a scribe to Fink demanding that BlackRock, quote, live up to its public commitment to climate action. And I'd love to hear what the climate crowd is going to possibly complain about after this year's shareholder season. For 2021, according to the Wall Street Journal, Fink means business. The journal notes that for the roughly 170 ESG shareholder proposals it voted on during the first half of the year, BlackRock backed 91% of environmental proposals, 23% of social proposals, and 26% of corporate governance proposals. And these votes matter. BlackRock is one of the top 3 shareholders in more than 80% of the S&P 500. Think about the enormous pressure that is on American business. The journal aptly notes that BlackRock, quote, casts a long shadow on shareholder meetings. That's right. And there were a few shareholder meetings that were particularly remarkable this year. One was Berkshire Hathaway's. BlackRock was publicly backing 2 shareholder resolutions from the left. One was designed to force Berkshire to increase disclosure of its climate risks across its entire portfolio. The other was aimed at increasing racial and gender diversity across the company's wide array of brands and businesses. ISS and Glass Lewis also recommended voting against numerous Berkshire Hathaway board members because the company wasn't, quote, working hard enough on sustainability. Think about that for a second. These 2 proxy advisory services have exactly $0, invested in Berkshire Hathaway. Yet they think they know better than Warren Buffett how the company should act on, quote, sustainability? And BlackRock's CEO Fink, who votes with other people's money, don't forget, thinks he knows more about how to run Berkshire Hathaway than the Oracle of Omaha? In a rare display of courage, we don't see a lot of that in the business community these days, Buffett stood up to the woke mob. He said that, quote, the overwhelming majority of people that bought shares with Berkshire with their own money voted against these propositions. Most of the votes for them came from people who never put a dime of their own money into Berkshire. He further sniped that making all the companies across Berkshire's sprawling empire fill out questionnaires on climate and racial statistics because some outside group said so was, quote, asinine. Buffett is right, of course, and he was able to stave off these 2 liberal ESG resolutions this year. And that's only in large part because so many Berkshire investors have great fidelity to Buffett. He's made them a lot of money. However, the Wall Street Journal rightly warned that once Buffett is no longer at the helm, the dike is likely to burst, even at Berkshire. The liberal shareholder proponents, they're going to outlast Buffett, and they're going to win in the end. And you should all know that Fink is absolutely lying through his teeth when it comes to ESG voting. At this year's BlackRock shareholder meeting, Scott confronted Fink about voting with other people's money in favor of left-leaning shareholder resolutions. Fink claimed with a straight face that he was merely devoting the will of his investors. That's a crock. If you crunch the numbers, and Steve did that, only 1.5% of all of the money invested in BlackRock is dedicated to ESG funds. Presumably, the other 98.5% of folks want to make money. So back to that date of May 26th, just how did a tiny hedge fund named Engine Number One manage to place 3 dissident climate activists on Exxon's board? Frankly, it was easy. ISS and Glass Lewis rigged the vote for them, and Larry Fink used other people's money to get them over the hump. So with all of the success that liberal climate activists and despotic leaders on Wall Street are having in influencing corporate behavior and corporate dollars, it would almost seem like they don't need any help from the Biden administration, right? Well, they're about to get it anyway. Again, the first 2 dates I mentioned, January 20th, when Biden canceled the Keystone permit. The second was April 14th, when Gary Gensler was confirmed to lead the SEC. In a moment, Steve is going to talk to you more about Gensler and what the other left-wing commissioners have planned at the SEC. Be warned, it's not terribly pretty. But I hope it's clear to you now that woke capital, activist investors, they're out to cancel traditional energy, full stop. And Steve is going to tell you how the Biden administration's regulatory efforts are going to pile on. It's going to take bold action to slay this three-headed hydra. I hope we have the courage to do it. Thank you.